The Celestra station was not built. It was grown, a titanic lattice of bioluminescent coral metal stretching 40 kilometers across the orbital ring of a dead star. 47 civilizations had contributed to its construction over 6,000 years. It was the crown jewel of the Galactic Assembly, and tonight, every seat inside its grand chamber was filled. Ambassador Zara Okonkwo stepped off the transit pod and paused, letting her eyes adjust to the shifting spectrum light of the chamber's atmosphere processors. The air was a careful cocktail: oxygen for the humans, trace methane for the Kalathai, iridium-suspended vapor for the silicon-breathing Krovan. Zara's aide, a young man named Tobias Ferreira, adjusted her ceremonial sash and whispered in her ear. 61 delegations present, Ambassador. Standing record. They came to watch us fail, Zara murmured, not unkindly. She was 44 years old, a former Lagos city planner who had pivoted into xenodiplomacy after humanity's first contact 19 years ago. She had dark brown skin, close-cropped silver hair that had come early, and the calm eyes of someone who had survived 3 flood disasters and a Senate confirmation hearing. She was, by any measure, unimpressed by grandeur. The grand chamber was arranged in concentric rings, species seated by stellar proximity. Humans sat in the outermost ring, a quiet insult nobody acknowledged, alongside the Brethani, a moth-like species known for their neutrality and spectacular cowardice. At the center dais floated Supreme Arbiter Velthon, a Zelthari elder whose 6 translucent wings refracted the chamber light into prismatic halos. The Zelthari had founded the Galactic Assembly 3,000 years ago. They considered themselves its eternal stewards. Zara had read everything about Velthon. Brilliant, politically ruthless, and, according to 3 independent intelligence analyses, personally responsible for the quarantine clause that kept humanity locked out of 17 key stellar trade routes. The session opened with the ritual tone of beginnings, a subsonic frequency that all species could physiologically detect, though none experienced it the same way. Humans felt it as a pressure behind the sternum, like standing at the edge of something vast. Today's agenda: the Vethra crisis. The Vethra system, 7 inhabited worlds, 4 of them human-colonized, had been struck by a cascade failure in their stellar relay network. Communications were dead. Supply lines were cut. 40 million people, mostly from the outer colonies of New Kigali, Porto Stellara, and the drift settlements, were facing resource collapse within 60 days. Humanity had formally requested emergency transit rights through Zelthari-controlled space, the only viable corridor to reach the Vethra system in time. The request had been pending for 11 days. Delegate Srnn of House Mirova rose first. The Kalathai were tall, silver-skinned, their faces arranged in elegant bilateral symmetry that human artists had spent decades trying to capture. Srnn was considered a moderate, which among the Kalathai meant she was only mildly contemptuous of younger civilizations. The Assembly recognizes the suffering of the Vethra populations, Srnn said, her translator rendering her melodic speech into flat galactic standard. However, the granting of emergency transit through sovereign corridors is a matter requiring full committee review. Standard processing time is 90 days. 40 million people. 90 days. The math was not complicated. Zara felt Tobias stiffen beside her. She placed a hand briefly on his arm. Ambassador Okonkwo, Velthon said, the Arbiter's voice carrying that particular quality that reminded Zara of someone who had never been told no. Does humanity's delegation have a statement? Zara stood. She had prepared a statement. 17 pages, carefully constructed, calibrated to appeal to Assembly precedent and Zelthari legal tradition. She had rehearsed it 4 times on the transit from Earth's diplomatic hub. She set it aside. Supreme Arbiter. Delegates. Her voice carried cleanly. She had always had that gift. 40 million human beings are running out of food, medicine, and heat. I have been sitting in this chamber for 11 days watching procedure be wielded like a weapon. I want to be very clear about what I am about to say, so the translation matrices render it with full precision. The chamber was quiet. Even the Krovan, who communicated in pressure burst and rarely paid attention to spoken proceedings, went still. Humanity came to this assembly in good faith 19 years ago. We accepted the outermost ring. We accepted the restricted trade routes. We accepted observer status for 6 years before we were granted voting rights. We were patient because we believed in what this body claims to represent, the protection of life across the stars. She looked directly at Velthon. If this assembly refuses to act within 48 hours, humanity will act unilaterally. We will send our ships through the Zelthari corridor without permission. If those ships are fired upon, we will defend them. And then, she paused, letting the silence work, we will walk out of this chamber. Not temporarily. Permanently. The noise that erupted was not chaos, it was something worse. It was the sound of 61 civilizations recalculating everything simultaneously. SRYN was the first to recover. Ambassador, that is a declaration of. It is a statement of intent to save 40 million lives, Zara said, still calm. You may call it whatever you like. Velthon's wings spread slightly, a Zelthari display that Zara had studied. Immense surprise. Genuine surprise. In 600 years of chairing the assembly, very little surprised Velthon anymore. You understand, the Arbiter said slowly, that unilateral action would invalidate humanity's assembly membership under Article 7 of the Celestra Accord. Yes, Zara said. I read Article 7. I also read Article 1. The one that says the assembly exists to preserve sentient life. I'm simply asking which article you believe in more. She sat down. The chamber did not recover. Session was suspended. In the corridors outside, in the delegates' lounges and communication alcoves, across the quantum-linked relay networks that connected Celestra to 100 homeworlds, the same conversation was happening in 61 different languages. The humans are serious. Are they? Look at her face. Tobias leaned close to Zara as they walked to the holding lounge. That wasn't the prepared statement. No. Fleet Command is going to have a panic attack. Fleet Command, Zara said quietly, should have thought about that before leaving 40 million people to die on a bureaucratic timeline. She stopped at the lounge window and looked out at the dead star around which Celestra orbited. It had burned for 8 billion years before going cold. Civilizations had risen and fallen in its light. 48 hours. Somewhere in the Vethra system, in a colony called New Kigali, a child was going to sleep hungry tonight. Zara had seen the transmission, 3 days old now, delayed by the relay failure. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, holding a stuffed fabricated animal and looking at a sky full of stars with absolute trust that someone, somewhere, was coming. Zara intended to be that someone. Her communicator buzzed. It was the Breathani delegate, the moth-like species that never took sides. We would like to speak privately, the message read. We may have a proposal. Zara looked at the message for a long moment. Then she smiled just slightly and typed back, my door is open. The galaxy was watching. Good. Voss 9 was not a glamorous place for secret meetings. The asteroid had been hollowed out 3 centuries ago by the Kalathai as a mining operation, then abandoned, then colonized by a loose federation of species who preferred their politics conducted away from official record. Its underground quarter, called Meridian Deep, smelled of recycled atmosphere and old ambition. Perfect. Zara arrived with only Tobias and a security detail of 2. The Breathani delegate, Tavara, was already waiting in a private chamber carved directly from the asteroid's iron-nickel rock, the walls still showing the drill bore patterns of Kalathai machines from centuries past. Tavara was smaller than Zara expected. The Breathani averaged 2 meters in height, but Tavara stood barely to Zara's shoulder, with wings the pale gold of old paper and enormous compound eyes that reflected the chamber light in fractured geometries. Their species communicated primarily through wing pattern modulation. The translator rendered it into carefully neutral galactic standard. Ambassador Okonkwo. You have rattled something very old and very comfortable. That was the intention, Zara said, sitting across the low table. You mentioned a proposal. First, context. Tavara's wings shifted in what the translation matrix flagged as diplomatic concern. The Breathani have been assembly members for 1,400 years. In that time we have watched 43 civilizations threaten to walk out. 39 of those threats were empty. 3 resulted in temporary withdrawal, followed by re-entry on worse terms. 1, the Velkari, never returned. And the Velkari? They built their own trade network. It took 200 years and enormous sacrifice. They are now the most economically independent civilization in the outer spiral arm. Tavara paused. They also have the lowest diplomatic leverage of any spacefaring species. Independence and influence are different currencies. Zara nodded slowly. You're warning me. I am educating you. There is a difference. The wing pattern shifted again, something the Matrix called careful hope. The Breathani have spent 1,400 years doing one thing well, surviving by being useful to everyone and threatening to no one. We have access that more powerful species do not, including access to Velthon. At that moment, the chamber's secondary entrance, a rough-cut door that looked like it belonged in an archaeological site, opened and Supreme Arbiter Velthon stepped through, alone, without staff, without the ceremonial wing spread that the Arbiter wore in official settings. Without the trappings of office, Velthon looked old. The translucent wings were thinner than they appeared under chamber light. The Zelthari elder moved carefully, the way beings who had lived very long lives moved, conserving energy, conscious of the body's limits. Zara stood instinctively. Velthon gestured for her to sit. "I did not come to negotiate," the Arbiter said, settling into a chair clearly designed for a species with a different skeletal arrangement. "I came because I am 847 years old and I have watched this assembly calcify for 6 centuries, and I find I am tired of pretending otherwise." Zara said nothing. She had learned, in a decade of diplomacy, that silence was often the most powerful statement available. "The quarantine clause," Velthon said. "You know about it. 3 of my analysts identified your role in drafting it. Your analysts are correct. I wrote it 22 years ago, before first contact, when humanity was still a species we monitored from a safe distance." The Arbiter's wings moved, something the translation matrix didn't categorize, which meant it was emotional enough to resist clinical description. "I wrote it because I was afraid." Zara blinked. It was the last thing she had expected to hear. "The Zelthari have maintained galactic order for 3 millennia, Velthon continued. "We are very good at order. We are not good at disruption. And humanity was the most disruptive thing we had ever observed. You went from pre-industrial civilization to interstellar capability in 300 years. 300. The Arbiter looked at Zara directly. "That should be impossible. Every model we had said it was impossible. And then you did it anyway." "We had help," Zara said quietly. "The Fermi drive discovery. The Nakamura equations. Every civilization has moments of discovery. None accelerated the way you did. Because it was never just the technology." Velthon leaned forward slightly. "It was what you did with the technology. Every new capability you immediately asked, how do we use this to help? Not how do we use this to survive? Not how do we use this to dominate? How do we use this to help? Do you understand how alien that is? To a species that has watched civilizations rise and fall for 3,000 years. Zara was quiet for a moment. "And that frightened you?" "Enormously." Velthon's wings settled. "Because I could not predict you. And things I cannot predict, I contain. The quarantine clause was a cage built out of fear. I am old enough to admit that now." Admiral Deo Marchetti's voice crackled over Zara's communicator. She had kept the channel open and Marchetti, commanding the human fleet currently positioned 3 light hours from the Zelthari corridor, was listening. She had told him to listen and say nothing unless the situation became kinetic. He had agreed mostly. "Ambassador," Marchetti's voice was low and controlled. The admiral was 60 years old, Nigerian-Italian, had commanded in 3 border disputes and been decorated twice for restraint, the rarest military decoration humanity awarded. "Fleet is holding. Your call." Zara looked at Velthon. "What are you offering?" "Emergency transit authorization. Personally issued, bypassing the committee. I still have that authority under Article 3, though I haven't used it in 400 years. The Arbiter paused. "In exchange for something. Name it. Don't walk out." Velthon's voice carried something that Zara recognized, because she had heard it in community meetings after the Lagos floods, in voices of city planners watching their maps become useless. It was the sound of someone watching something they'd built their life around begin to fail. "The assembly is imperfect. It is ancient and slow and it has accumulated centuries of compromise and corruption. But it is also the reason no civilization-ending war has occurred in the core systems for 2,000 years. If humanity leaves, not just the political damage. The symbolic damage. The message it sends to every younger civilization watching, that the assembly cannot protect you, cannot act in time, cannot be trusted." He looked at her steadily. "Your people are right to be angry. Your ultimatum was justified. But if you want to change this institution, and it needs to be changed, you can only do that from inside it." Zara sat very still. She thought about the little girl in New Kigali. She thought about the 47 civilizations in that chamber, most of whom had come to watch humanity fail. She thought about the Valkyrie, independent and isolated, their own masters influencing nothing. She thought about what it meant to help. "Transit authorization first," she said. "My fleet moves within the hour. Then we talk about reform." Velthon nodded once. "Agreed." Tavara's wings blazed briefly in a pattern the translator rendered simply as relief. Marchetti's voice, "Ambassador. You heard?" "I heard. Plot the corridor route. We're going in authorized. Get those ships moving, Deo." There's a little girl in New Kigali who's been waiting long enough. New Kigali had been built the way most frontier colonies were built, optimistically, incrementally, and with a faith in supply chains that the Vethra crisis had brutally exposed. The city sat in a wide river valley on Vethra IV's northern continent, surrounded by bioluminescent forest that the original colonists had named the lanternwood because on clear nights it glowed a deep, steady blue. The glow came from symbiotic fungi in the tree roots, harmless and beautiful and completely useless for the current problem. Dr. Amara Diallo had not slept in 31 hours. The colony's chief medical officer was 48, Senegalese-born, trained at the University of Dakar and then at the Mars Institute of Xenobiology. She had come to New Kigali 6 years ago for what was supposed to be a 2-year research appointment and had stayed because, as she put it in her journal, the work kept being necessary. The medical center, a sprawling prefab structure at the valley's eastern edge, had been running on ration power for 9 days. The stellar relay failure had not just cut communications. It had cascaded through the colony's power distribution grid, which relied on relay-synchronized fusion protocols. They were running on backup batteries and desperation. Insulin supplies, her assistant, a young man named Felix, reported from the inventory station. 17 days left at current rationing. 43 patients insulin-dependent. 17 days. Amara wrote it down. She was keeping a physical paper log. She'd learned in the Lagos hospital system before emigrating that when digital systems failed, paper survived. What about the dialysis unit? 2 sessions left on the backup power before we have to shut it down. 8 patients on dialysis. If the power went, those 8 patients died. The math, as Zara Okonkwo was facing in a diplomatic chamber 60 light-years away, was straightforward and terrible. Engineer Kozai Watanabe arrived at a run, dodging through the medical center entrance with the particular energy of someone who had found a problem and solved half of it. He was 36, Japanese-Brazilian, had been hired 3 years ago to maintain New Kigali's infrastructure and had since quietly become the reason the colony still functioned at a basic level. He had taken apart and rebuilt the fusion backup system twice since the crisis began. Good news and less good news, Kozai announced. Good news first, Amara said. Always. I found a power surplus in the agricultural sector. The hydroponics arrays have secondary cells that aren't in the main grid. They were installed by the original builders as a redundancy and then forgotten when the main grid got expanded. I can bridge them to the medical center. Amara stared at him. How much power? Enough to run the dialysis unit for another 30 days and stabilize the cold storage for the insulin. Kozai. She gripped his arm. That's not less good news, that's extraordinary news. What's the catch? The agricultural arrays go dark. No growing for 30 days. Silence. They looked at each other. The colony's food surplus was already depleted from the supply line cut. The hydroponics arrays were producing 40% of their remaining nutritional base. How long until people get seriously malnourished without the arrays? Amara asked. 30 to 40 days for the most vulnerable. Children. Elderly. Already ill. Amara sat down on the edge of a supply crate and put her face in her hands for exactly 5 seconds. Then she took them away. Do it, she said. Bridge the power. We treat the immediate mortality risk first and trust that someone is coming with supplies. Kozai nodded once. I'll have it connected in 6 hours. Good. She stood. Felix, I need you to organize the colony's food inventory. Full count, every household, every storage unit. We redistribute equitably. Anyone hoarding gets a very direct conversation from me personally. Felix, 22 years old and thoroughly terrified of Amara in the best possible way, went immediately. Outside the medical center, New Kigali was in that particular state that frontier communities entered under pressure. Not chaos but compression. People moved with purpose. Neighbors helped neighbors. The colony's social fabric, which had been woven over 15 years of shared hardship and shared success, was holding. Just on the colony's main square, a community board had been erected, physical, old-fashioned, covered in handwritten notes. Food sharing. Contact Yang's family, Block 7. Water recyclers for loan. Oduya household. Medical volunteers needed. Children had decorated the edges with drawings of supply ships descending through Vethra IV's atmosphere. One drawing near the bottom left showed a small girl and a large starship. Underneath, in careful 6-year-old handwriting, they are coming. Her name was Adiz. She was the daughter of the colony's head botanist. She had drawn the same picture 4 times in the past week. Commander Priya Nkemdaram was 39, had commanded the relief vessel Resolve for 3 years, and had executed 17 emergency supply operations in the outer systems. She was, by the assessment of everyone who served under her, the best emergency response officer in the human fleet, not because she was the most aggressive but because she was the most prepared. When the transit authorization came through on her command channel, Velthon, Supreme Arbiter, authorization code Alpha 7 clear, emergency passage granted, corridor Zelthari 7, she had already plotted 4 possible approach vectors and preloaded the cargo manifests for maximum delivery efficiency. Navigation, she said, her voice steady on the bridge of the Resolve. Best speed to Vethra 4. We have people waiting. The Resolve was not alone. 3 other human relief vessels broke formation with her, the Harambe, the Persistence, and the Bright Constant. Together they carried 40,000 tons of medical supplies, food, power cells, and technical equipment. Admiral Marchetti's voice on the fleet channel, corridor is clear. Zelthari defense system standing down per authorization. You have a clean run, Commander. Nkemdaram allowed herself one breath of pure relief. Then, maximum thrust. We're late. 60 light-years away, in a diplomatic lounge on Celestra Station, Zara Okonkwo received the confirmation ping and sat quietly for a long moment before she allowed herself to close her eyes. The Resolve entered Vethra space 11 days after Zara's ultimatum. The relay network, reparable it turned out with the right technical team, was restored within 72 hours of the fleet's arrival. 40 million people exhaled. Zara had spent those 11 days on Celestra, in meetings she had not anticipated and conversations that would, she suspected, shape the next century of galactic politics. The first surprise came from the Krovan. The Krovan were, by reputation, the least emotionally legible species in the assembly. Silicon-based, they communicated in pressure burst and electromagnetic modulation, their translated speech rendering into a flat, effect-neutral galactic standard that made them sound like extremely well-informed computers. They were ancient, older than the Zelthari, and were considered by most assembly members to be reliable votes for the status quo. Delegate Amori Vex requested a private meeting 2 days after the transit authorization. They met in the archive quarter of Celestra Station, a section of the station that housed 3 millennia of assembly records and crystalline data matrices, the air there denser and cooler than the rest of the station. Amori Vex communicated through a translator node the size of a dinner plate, its surface covered in pressure-sensitive membranes. The Krovan have observed humanity for 19 years, Amori Vex said, the translator rendering each burst into careful words. We have compiled 847,000 data points on human decision-making behavior in high-stakes scenarios. Zara waited. Our models predicted a 12% probability that Ambassador Okonkwo's ultimatum was genuine. The remaining 88% probability distribution covered various forms of diplomatic theater. And now, we are revising our models. A long pause, pressure burst communication contained emotional information in its duration. The Krovan were the original architects of the Article 7 membership clause, the one that would have invalidated humanity's assembly membership for unilateral action. We inserted it 1,800 years ago to contain a species called the Velreni who had become dangerously expansionist. Zara remembered Tavara's mention of the Velkari. She made a mental note that the names were similar enough to be related. You used it to contain us, she said. We used the architecture that existed. But the Krovan do not use tools without understanding them. We have spent 19 years watching humanity, and we have concluded something that our models resist but our observations support. Which is, humanity does not expand to dominate. Humanity expands to connect. Another pressure burst pause. This is not something we have observed in any other spacefaring civilization, including ourselves. Zara absorbed that. To connect. She thought of New Kigali, of the little girl's drawing, of Cozy Eye bridging power systems to save dialysis patients at the cost of food production, trusting that help was coming. Of Amara making triage decisions with the same calm she herself brought to diplomatic chambers. The Krovan, Amori Vex continued, would like to co-sponsor a reform proposal. Article 7 Amendment. Emergency Humanitarian Response Protocols. Expedited Transit Authorization Framework. That would require significant political capital. Yes. The Krovan have been accumulating political capital for 3,000 years. It is, the translator rendered what might have been dry humor, time to spend some of it. The second surprise came from SRYN. The Kalathai delegate had been Zara's primary obstacle in the early assembly sessions. Elegant, procedurally immaculate, and deeply committed to the pace of existing systems. SRNN requested a meeting over what the Calathi called a sharing meal, an intimate diplomatic tradition in which participants ate together, a gesture that, in Calathi culture, implied personal rather than institutional conversation. They met in a private dining room, and SRNN ate something translucent and geometric while Zara worked through a reconstructed Nigerian groundnut soup that the station kitchen produced with only 3 of the 7 intended ingredients. "My opposition to your transit request was not personal," SRNN said. "I want you to understand that." "I know," Zara said. "It was institutional." "Yes. And institutional opposition is more dangerous than personal opposition, because it doesn't need a reason. It reproduces itself." SRNN was quiet for a moment. "I was born in the assembly. My mother was a delegate. Her mother before her. The assembly is not an abstraction to me, it is family. It is home. When you threatened to walk out, I was afraid. Not of losing our vote. Of losing the idea that the assembly could hold anyone. If humanity left, a species that had been patient for 19 years, that had accepted the outermost ring, that had played by every rule, what message does that send to every frustrated civilization watching? When the system fails, you leave. And then the assembly doesn't reform. It fragments. And fragmentation, historically, precedes war." Zara set down her spoon. "You were right to be afraid. I knew that when I made the threat. It was a calculated risk." "How did you calculate it?" "I calculated that the assembly would rather reform than fragment. That enough members, Tavara, Velthon, whoever else had been waiting for a catalyst, would move if someone gave them a reason." She paused. "I was betting on this body being better than it had been behaving." SRNN looked at her for a long moment. "That," the Calathi delegate said finally, "is a profoundly strange way to conduct diplomacy. Where I come from," Zara said, "we call it having faith." In the archive quarter, Tobias was working late, cross-referencing assembly precedents for the reform proposal. He found something in a 900-year-old record, a Zelthari speech, never formally submitted, found in an uncatalogued data matrix in the archive's lower levels. He brought it to Zara. She read it alone in the corridor outside the chamber, while the station's artificial night cycle dimmed the corridor lights. It was Velthon's voice, 900 years younger but recognizable. A speech that had apparently been prepared for an assembly session that never happened, after a crisis that had been resolved differently. "We are not guardians of order," the young Velthon had written. "We are custodians of the possibility of order. There is a difference. A custodian knows that the thing in their care does not belong to them. A custodian works in service of the thing, not in service of their own tenure. When we forget this, the assembly stops being a forum for civilization and becomes a monument to our own endurance." Zara read it twice. Then she sent it to Velthon with a single message. "I think you wrote this for today." The response came 20 minutes later. "I wrote it for the day when someone would finally need it." The resolve landed in New Kigali's northern field on a morning when the lanternwood was burning its deepest blue. Commander Priya and Kemdarim stood at the cargo ramp as it descended, watching the colony come forward to meet them. It was not the chaotic rush she sometimes saw in acute crisis landings. This was something more organized, more dignified. People moved in measured lines, the colony's logistics teams directing cargo flow with the precision of people who had been preparing for this moment for days. Dr. Amara Diallo met her at the base of the ramp. "Commander." Amara's handshake was firm and brief. "I need the medical cargo prioritized. Cold chain items first, insulin and biologics. Then the power cells." "Already sorted," Nkemdarim said. "Manifest is color-coded. Your people can begin unloading immediately." Amara nodded, then did something unexpected. She stopped. Looked at Nkemdarim for a moment without the logistics brain engaged. "How did you get through the corridor?" she asked. "The relay failure also cut our news feeds. We didn't know until the fleet appeared in our sky." Nkemdarim hesitated, then answered honestly, "Your ambassador stood up in front of 61 civilizations and told them that human lives were more important than procedure. And then she convinced the oldest being in the Galactic Assembly to do the right thing." Amara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Her name?" "Zara Okonkwo." Amara nodded, storing it somewhere permanent. "Tell her thank you from New Kigali. Tell her we held." The unloading took 14 hours. Engineers from the Harambee had the relay network fully restored by midnight. The Persistence carried a specialized technical team that assisted Kozii in rebuilding the power distribution grid, properly this time, with redundancies that wouldn't require impossible choices between dialysis and food production. In the colony's medical center, 8 dialysis patients who had been counting days were no longer counting. On the main square, the community board stayed up. The drawings stayed too, including Adi's supply ship ascending through Vethra IV's sky. Adi's herself found Commander Nkemdarim the next morning, near the cargo staging area, with the solemn purposefulness of a 6-year-old on official business. "Are you the ship captain?" she asked. "I am," Nkemdarim said. Adi's considered this. "I knew you were coming," she said. "I know," Nkemdarim said. "I heard." She crouched to the child's level. "What made you sure?" Adi's thought about it with the careful seriousness that some children bring to important questions. "Because we're people," she said finally. "And people come for people." Nkemdarim held that for a moment. Then she said, "You're right." On Celestra Station, the Grand Chamber convened for the first full session since Zara's ultimatum. The atmosphere was different from any session Tobias had attended. He couldn't define it precisely, only note that 61 species seemed to be sitting slightly differently. More forward. More present. Zara stood at the central podium for the first time. Normally the central podium was reserved for arbiters and founding civilizations. Velthon had offered it to her specifically. She looked out at the rings. The outermost, where humanity sat. The inner circles of older power. The Zelthri at the center, wings folded, watching her. "I want to begin," she said, by acknowledging what almost happened. Humanity came very close to walking out of this chamber. We were right to make that threat. And I believe we were right not to execute it. She paused. Because the question was never whether humanity could survive without the assembly. We could. We are resilient enough and, I say this without arrogance, capable enough to build our own networks if we had to. She let that land. The question was what kind of galaxy we wanted to build. Isolation has its logic. Independence has its dignity. But 40 million people in the Vethra system needed this assembly to work, and they needed it to work now, and if the lesson we take from this crisis is that the assembly is irreparable and abandonment is the answer, then the next civilization facing a Vethra-scale emergency will have nowhere to turn. She looked at SRNN, who met her gaze steadily. The Kalathai were right that reckless unilateral action is dangerous. The Krovan were right that institutional architecture shapes behavior across centuries. The Brethani were right that survival through usefulness is a legitimate strategy. And Supreme Arbiter Velthon was right that an institution must serve life, not itself, or it has no reason to exist. She unfolded a document, physical paper, old-fashioned, the kind she used when she wanted something to feel permanent. I am co-sponsoring with the Krovan delegation and the Brethani delegation, the Vethra Reform Accords. Mandatory emergency humanitarian response timelines. Automatic expedited transit authorization for life-threatening crises. Independent review of Article 7 membership clauses. And a new seat in this chamber, not an outermost ring, not an observer tier, a full voting seat in the second ring for humanity. The chamber was not silent this time. It was loud. In 61 different kinds of sound, pressure burst, subsonic, melodic, mechanical. Something was happening that Tobias, watching from the delegation seats, found himself struggling to name. He settled on agreement. Not unanimous. Several Zelthari Inner Circle members showed wing patterns that the translation matrix flagged as dissent and concern. The Trellic delegation, a mercantile species known for profiting from restricted trade routes, sat entirely still in a way that suggested they would be filing objections within the hour. But the vote, when Velthon called it, passed. 39 in favor. 14 opposed. 8 abstaining. Humanity moved from the outermost ring. Zara sat in the new seat, second ring, 7th position, and looked out at the chamber differently from that angle. She could see more faces. More species. She could see, for the first time from inside this room, the full shape of what the assembly had built across 3,000 years, and what it still had the capacity to become. Velthon descended from the Arbiter's dais, another thing that apparently hadn't happened in centuries, and stopped at Zara's seat. Ambassador Okonkwo. The ancient Zelthari looked at her steadily. You said, in this chamber 11 days ago, that you were asking which article we believed in more. Article 7 or Article 1. I remember. I have been thinking about that question. Velthon's wings settled. I believe the answer is that they were never meant to be in conflict. Article 7 exists to protect the assembly so that the assembly can fulfill Article 1. When Article 7 becomes a tool to obstruct Article 1, we have lost the thread. The Arbiter paused. You found the thread. We all found it, Zara said. Together. Velthon nodded once. Then returned to the dais. The session continued. There was more work to do, there always was. The Trellick objections would need addressing. The reform implementation would take time. 3 of the Outer Ring species had quietly signaled interest in similar transit authorization discussions for their own regions, and those conversations would require their own diplomatic architecture. Tobias set up his workstation and began making notes. Zara opened a new channel on her communicator and sent a message to the relay network, now restored, now carrying signal cleanly across 60 light-years to Vethra 4. New Kigali. Supplies are on their way. New protocols are in place. You will not be forgotten again. Okonkwo Celestra. The reply came 3 hours later, in a child's handwriting photographed on paper and transmitted as an image. Thank you. We knew. Adiz. Below the text, a drawing. A woman in a diplomatic sash standing in the center of a circle of stars, arms open, all the stars leaning in. Zara saved it. She would carry it, she decided, to every session she ever sat in this chamber for as long as she served. The galaxy had watched in fear as humans prepared to walk out. What it hadn't expected, what it was still processing across 61 civilizations and 3,000 years of accumulated assumptions, was that humanity had never intended to leave. Humanity had intended to stay.